Hi there, welcome to another edition of the Israel-Palestine Report. And today, unfortunately, we'll be talking about the death of 8 IDF soldiers over the last week and what's causing these increased losses in the military over the last few days. It seems that once again, the losses in the last week have been very high. In fact, it's the most Israel has lost in a week in 2025. So what exactly is going on? I tried to get some answers, talked to some people, did some research. Let's start with what happened in the morning. At 6:10 a.m. during a ground assault, the 98th Division in Bani Suheila, near the Israeli border, was operating on a Hamas compound which covered a tunnel system. The IDF had already operated in that area and neutralized the Hamas positions there. And now we're coming back. That is not uncommon. The IDF has withdrawn from several places and gone back, sometimes once, twice, three, in some cases up to 5 times in the same spot, losing soldiers, coming back, losing soldiers, and then coming back. Now, there's been some speculation, as there usually is when these cases occur, of why this didn't happen from the air. But what we're talking about is operations where the IDF goes in order to try to find tunnel shafts and neutralize them. And in some cases, also destroy the tunnels that are underneath it. That requires ground troops. The use of Air Force and bombing in Gaza has been absolutely unprecedented. The massive amounts of armaments that have been used on such a small area are unprecedented. But the Air Force has had very limited success in taking out tunnels and underground infrastructure because Hamas digs them at a sufficient depth where they're, I wouldn't say invulnerable, but if there's damage done to them from bombing, it's not that difficult to fix ultimately. And therefore, ground troops have to go in and neutralize it. Once ground troops go in and neutralize, very often Hamas go back and rebuild it. And this is the kind of war that we're talking about. Now, in this particular case, um, before ground troops went in, the target, the building in which this occurred, had received significant advanced fire, in particular from tanks. Um, and it was hoped that there was sufficient fire used to kill any Hamas that were in there. There weren't any in there. And also possibly to set off any booby traps that had been placed in the area. That did not that did not go according to plan. Now, you have to understand what's happening here. Hamas is not fighting the IDF. Early on in the war, they confronted the IDF directly, had some successes killing IDF soldiers, but generally the IDF brushed them aside quite easily. They're not particularly good at fighting face to face. Fighting the IDF face to face is very difficult. Over time, they scaled back that element of their warfare until now it's basically non-existent. They've realized that it's much better to keep the forces in reserve and to keep them in supposed humanitarian areas, to keep them in tunnels, to keep them embedded among the civilian population, so that they can be used when necessary to keep control over the area. Because Hamas has realized that because of the Israeli strategy, they can remain in charge. So they keep their forces in the areas where they are in charge and underground when they're being bombed. But that doesn't mean that they're not confronting the IDF. When the IDF leaves an area, Hamas comes in, repairs the tunnels, and lays new booby traps um, in different arrays, in different places, in order to keep the IDF on its toes. Most of these booby traps are, of course, neutralized without casualties, but sometimes they go off killing IDF soldiers, and that's what happened in this event. None of this is happening due to face-to-face fighting. So, one medical officer gave an interesting interview to Ynet about what's going on in Gaza right now, which I found very illuminating. He said, we've seen all types of combat, but now it's less about gunfire and more about explosives. This person, by the way, served 300 days in reserves, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, previously fighting in Lebanon and Gaza. He said the difference between now and earlier in Gaza is, quote, the last time there were more enemy fighters and more clashes. Now it's mostly underground. Wherever we go, we dismantle, end quote. Now, in this kind of fighting, the large amount of IDF that's in Gaza right now, we're talking about 5 divisions, is actually a boon. It gives them more targets to look for. What Hamas is looking for now are not only places to lay booby traps, but also isolated soldiers and groups of soldiers that they may be able to pick off or trap in various ways. They have a very target-rich environment right now, and all the soldiers paradoxically help them in achieving their military goals. Another thing that is making this more difficult is the aid distribution. So there's a few points of GHF aid distribution now. They're deep inside Gaza. Their routes are known to Hamas. Israel and the IDF safeguard those routes. They patrol the areas where the uh, aid is delivered. That all means that the IDF's movements are becoming more and more predictable. They're turning into sitting ducks. This is one of the reasons the IDF has resisted giving out the aid itself, um, because it's been worried about this. So it's not giving out the aid itself, but it still has to adjust itself to the delivery, which makes it much more predictable. So this same individual, this officer, said, quote, many terrorists appear to have dropped their weapons and moved into civilian areas. That means Hamas has fewer fighters in the field. It's still a fight, but we can see the difference. Another thing about this predictability is, of course, you're not running into any hostages. The Hamas know where people are, where the IDF is going. The IDF is going very slowly, very methodically, has no problem getting hostages out of harm's way in order to elude the IDF. And the IDF is now working very slowly. Same officer said the following. Thinking we can wrap it up quickly with one big blow is a mistake. We must build a military that can fight long, drawn-out campaigns. That doesn't mean we don't want short wars, but the enemy has adapted. When they realize we can fight long-term, their attrition strategy will lose effectiveness, end quote. But it's not so clear that that's what's happening. The attrition strategy, while taking immense toll on Gaza, isn't taking an immense toll on Hamas. Hamas is, as we said, avoiding fighting. They're sacrificing the civilians of Gaza in order to stay in power. And the attrition, meanwhile, is affecting Israel quite a bit. First of all, there's the diplomatic element, which we've talked about here. Israel's standing in the world is evaporating. But aside from that, there's also the very real wear and tear on the military, especially on the reserves. This hasn't gotten a lot of play in the media, but in Israel, a lot of people are talking about how burnt out soldiers are, and it's reaching critical mass. For example, a few soldiers in Battalion 931 of the Nachal Brigade asked not to go back into Gaza. They wrote the following to their commander. We've done 17 rounds of entering Gaza. 17 rounds. We've been through countless operations, fought for many long months, and lost many of our friends. We're way past our release date and under emergency orders. We did everything we could. We're not mentally capable of going back into the strip. And for their efforts, they were fined 1,500 shekels and given a reprimand. This is how a lot of the soldiers right now are feeling. And of course, the fact that Haredi men are not willing to go into the army and are getting a dispensation, and the government might fall over that, only makes all this worse. So we're talking right now about a very slow war of attrition. The early prognostications for Gideon's chariots were that it would take 2 months. It's already been 1 month. It doesn't look like it's going to be over in another month. And Hamas has figured out how to inflict losses on Israel without getting too many losses itself. That is very bad news for the IDF. Further bad news, of course, we've also already talked about this. Hamas has basically replenished its ranks. It had close to 40,000 fighters at the beginning of the war. That probably went down to below 20,000 at some point. Now, according to estimates, they're back to the same level in the 30,000s, maybe 40,000 that they had before the war. They're even managing to regain their rocket launching capability. And the reason for all this is because Israel is allowing Hamas to remain in power in certain areas, it seems intentionally, and that is allowing them to cause damage, kill IDF soldiers, and remain in control of the Gaza Strip. So something in the Israeli strategy is going to have to change. Okay, if you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon, subscribe to my Substack, and listen to my History of the Land of Israel podcast. I'll be here again very soon when something interesting happens.